I'm tired. I've been working all day. I just need to rest. Before she could finish, he grabbed her arm, pulling her close. His grip was bruising, his breath reeking of alcohol. Tired, he spat. You think you're too good for me now? Is that it? No, Chitty, I just... Shut up, he roared, cutting her off. You'll do what I say. You're my wife. You don't get to tell me no. Ngozi felt her knees buckle, but she stood firm, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. I'm carrying your child, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, let me rest tonight. But her plea only fueled his anger. He shoved her onto the bed, pinning her down with a force that made her cry out. You'll rest when I'm done with you, he growled, his hands pressing her down as she struggled weakly beneath him. Chitty, stop, she begged, tears streaming down her face. Please, stop. In her desperation, she tried to push him away, her fingers clawing at his arm. One of her nails accidentally scratched him, leaving a faint red mark. Chitty froze. His eyes darkened as he stared at the scratch on his skin. You dare scratch me?
The night was cold, but the heat of pain burned through her body. Ngozi lay curled on the hard, cracked floor of their small bedroom, clutching her swollen belly. The faint glow of the moon spilled through the window, illuminating the fresh bruise spreading across her cheek. Get up, Chidi barked from above her, his voice echoing with venom. Don't act like you're helpless now, Ngozi whimpered, struggling to push herself off the floor. Every muscle in her body ached, and the weight of her unborn child made it harder to move. Tears streaked her face as she held her belly protectively. Please, Chitty the baby, she begged, her voice trembling. He grabbed her arm roughly and yanked her to her feet. Ngozi cried out, but her voice was muffled as he shoved her back against the wall. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot and reeking of alcohol. You think you can embarrass me in front of the neighbors? He snarled. Do you know what people will say if they find out my wife can't follow simple instructions? I didn't mean to. Ngozi sobbed, her hands trembling as she clutched at the wall for support. Gina tried to reassure her daughter by placing her hands on the woman's shoulders. It's okay, I didn't mean it. You didn't mean to burn the stew? He slapped her hard across the face, the sound of the impact echoing in the room. You didn't mean to leave the door unlocked? You don't mean to be useless, but here you are. Ngozi's knees buckled, and she slid back down to the floor. Her vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let herself cry out again. She had learned long ago that her pain only fueled his anger. But it isn't hard. Hours passed in silence after Chidi finally left the room, slamming the door behind him. Ngozi remained on the floor, cradling her belly. Shh, my baby, she whispered, tears dripping onto her hands. Don't listen to him. Don't feel this pain. It's not your fault. But deep down, she knew that her child could feel every moment of her suffering. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she dared not say aloud. How much longer could she endure this? How much longer could she protect her baby from the monster she once called her husband? As dawn began to break, Ngozi sat up slowly, her body screaming in protest. She stared at the door, the faint light of morning spilling through the gaps. Something inside her had started to shift. She didn't know how, but she knew this. Her story wasn't over yet.
The morning brought no relief. The faint light filtering through the tattered curtains only illuminated the mess of Ngozi's world. Her body ached from the blows of the previous night, and her heart weighed heavy with despair. She slowly pulled herself up, careful not to jolt her belly. Chidi will wake soon, she thought with dread. The man who once whispered promises of love now woke with curses on his lips, his wrath growing more relentless by the day. Ngozi limped to the kitchen, her feet dragging on the cold cement floor. She started preparing his breakfast, her hands shaking as she sliced the yam. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, she couldn't afford another mistake. The sound of Chitty's heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Her heart dropped, her grip on the knife tightening as though it could shield her from him. He appeared in the doorway, his face twisted in irritation. "This is the nonsense you call breakfast?" he sneered, eyeing the half-cooked jam on the plate. "Do you even think before you do anything, Ngozi?" I am sorry," she stammered, quickly reaching for the pot on the stove. "It's not ready yet." "I'll..." Before she could finish, he grabbed her wrist, yanking her so hard that the knife fell from her hand and clattered to the floor. "Don't you dare serve me rubbish again," he bellowed, his grip like a vice. Ngozi gasped, tears spilling from her eyes. "Please, Chitty. I'll fix it. Just, let go." He shoved her back, and she stumbled, barely catching herself on the edge of the counter. Her belly throbbed, and she instinctively cradled it. "Stop acting like you're fragile," he spat. "You think being pregnant gives you an excuse to be useless?" Ngozi stayed silent, her eyes cast downward. She had learned not to respond. Any word, any look, could set him off further. But Chitty wasn't done. He grabbed the plate of food and flung it against the wall, the yam splattering like her shattered spirit. "Clean it up," he ordered, his voice dripping with disdain. "And don't even think about eating until you get it right." Ngozi sank to her knees, silently picking up the broken pieces of ceramic and yam. Her tears mixed with the dirt on the floor, but she didn't let herself cry out loud. She had no room for her own pain, only the safety of her unborn child. The day dragged on in much the same way, with Chitty's voice cutting into her like knives. By evening, Ngozi sat in the corner of their small bedroom, clutching her belly as her child kicked weakly inside her. "I'm sorry, my baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry I can't protect you from him. I'm sorry this is the world you'll come into." The sound of Chitty's drunken singing from the living room made her flinch. She knew what the night would bring. It always did. When he finally stumbled into the bedroom, the stench of alcohol hit her like a wave. He towered over her, his shadow engulfing her small frame. "Why are you just sitting there?" He slurred, pulling her up by her arm. "You think you can ignore me now?" Ngozi winced as his grip tightened, his fingers pressing into the bruises from the night before. "Please, Chitty. I'm tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tired?" he mocked, laughing bitterly. "You'll be tired when I say you're tired." He pushed her onto the bed, and Ngozi's breath hitched. The cycle was endless, and no one heard her cries in the darkness. The hours crawled by, and when Chitty finally fell asleep, Ngozi sat in silence, staring at the man who had once held her hand so gently. The love she had once felt for him was now buried beneath layers of fear and pain. Her mind churned with thoughts she had never allowed herself to dwell on before. Could she survive this? Could her baby? For the first time, a flicker of defiance stirred within her. It was faint, like a candle in the wind, but it was there. One day, she thought, this will end. It has to. Ngozi sat at the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the cracks on the wall as the faint hum of the night filled the air. Her swollen belly felt heavier than ever, not just with the weight of her unborn child, but with the unbearable burden of her life. The bruises on her arms and legs told a story of pain that words could never capture. Her lips quivered as she held her belly protectively, whispering to her unborn child, "You don't deserve this. None of this. I promise, one day, we'll be free." The sound of Chitty's heavy footsteps shattered the fragile silence. Her heart raced as the bedroom door swung open, slamming against the wall. He stood there, swaying slightly, the stench of alcohol clinging to him like a curse. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression twisted into something monstrous. "What are you sitting there for?" he barked, his voice rough and cold. "Do you think you can just sit around and do nothing?" Ngozi swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Chitty, I cleaned the house. I cooked. Shut up," he bellowed, cutting her off. He stepped closer, towering over her. "You think I care about your excuses? You think you're better than me, don't you?" No, I don't, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm just trying to. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist and pulling her to her feet. She cried out as pain shot through her arm, but he didn't care. He never cared. Stop playing the victim, he shouted, shaking her violently. You've always been useless, Ngozi. Useless. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, clutching her belly as tears streamed down her face. Please, Chidi, the baby. The baby? He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. That baby is the only reason I've kept you here. Don't think you're special. Without it, you're nothing to me. Ngozi's heart shattered into a million pieces. She had known Chidi didn't love her anymore, but hearing those words felt like a dagger to her soul. Her tears fell freely now, her sobs quiet and broken. Chidi paced the room, muttering under his breath. He picked up a glass from the bedside table and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, sending shards flying. Ngozi flinched, her arms instinctively wrapping around her belly. You're pathetic, he spat, glaring at her. I don't know why I ever married you. Ngozi didn't respond. She had no words left. Her spirit was crushed, her voice silenced by years of pain and fear. Hours later, long after Chidi had stumbled off to sleep, Ngozi sat in the darkness, her body trembling with suppressed sobs. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, sadness, and something else. Something unfamiliar. A spark. She looked down at her belly, her hands trembling as they rested on the curve of her child. I can't let you grow up like this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I can't let you see this, feel this. Her tears fell faster, but this time, they weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of determination. Ngozi glanced at the small window across the room. The moonlight streamed in, bathing the room in a soft glow. It was the only light in her dark world, and in that moment, it felt like a sign. I don't know how, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible. But I will protect you. I will find a way out of this. As the first rays of dawn peeked over the horizon, Ngozi made a silent vow. She would endure whatever she had to, but she would not let her child grow up in this nightmare. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. The day had been merciless for Ngozi. She had been on her feet since dawn, scrubbing floors, cooking, and washing Chidi's clothes, all while enduring the searing heat that seemed to mock her exhaustion. Her swollen feet ached, and her back throbbed from carrying the weight of her pregnancy. Yet, as always, she bore it silently. Complaining only invited trouble. By the time the moon rose, Ngozi could barely stand. Her legs wobbled as she shuffled to their bedroom, hoping for a moment of rest. But as soon as she stepped inside, she felt his presence, Chidi, seated on the bed, a predatory glint in his eyes. Her heart sank. You think you're done for the day? He sneered, standing up and moving toward her. Chidi, please, Ngozi started, her voice trembling. I'm tired. I've been working all day. I just need to rest. Before she could finish, he grabbed her arm, pulling her close. His grip was bruising, his breath reeking of alcohol. Tired, he spat. You think you're too good for me now? Is that it? No, Chidi, I just... Shut up, he roared, cutting her off. You'll do what I say. You're my wife. You don't get to tell me no. Ngozi felt her knees buckle, but she stood firm, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. I'm carrying your child, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, let me rest tonight. But her plea only fueled his anger. He shoved her onto the bed, pinning her down with a force that made her cry out. You'll rest when I'm done with you, he growled, his hands pressing her down as she struggled weakly beneath him. Chidi, stop, she begged, tears streaming down her face. Please, stop. In her desperation, she tried to push him away, her fingers clawing at his arm. One of her nails accidentally scratched him, leaving a faint red mark. Chidi froze. His eyes darkened as he stared at the scratch on his skin. You dare scratch me? He hissed, his voice low and menacing. I didn't mean to, Ngozi sobbed. It was an accident. Before she could finish, he slapped her across the face, the sound echoing through the room. You think you can hurt me and get away with it? He snarled. Ngozi's vision blurred from the force of the blow, her cheek stinging with pain. Chitty's rage was like a storm, unpredictable and destructive. He finished with her angrily, showing no regard for her pain or protests. When he was done, he grabbed her by the arm and dragged her off the bed. You think you can defy me? He shouted, pulling her toward the door. Let's see how you like sleeping outside. Chitty, please. Ngozi cried, struggling against his grip. I'm pregnant. I can't sleep outside. But her words fell on deaf ears. Chitty yanked the door open and shoved her out with such force that she stumbled and fell to the ground. Before she could get up, the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. Ngozi sat on the cold, hard ground, her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. The night air was bitterly cold, and the ground felt like ice beneath her. She hugged herself, her tears falling freely as she whispered, Why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? She looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly as if mocking her despair. She thought about her unborn child, about the life growing inside her. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry you have to feel this too. Hours passed, and Ngozi sat in silence, her body shivering from the cold. She could hear Chitty's snores through the door, each one a reminder of his cruelty. As dawn broke, Ngozi's resolve hardened. She realized something that terrified her. Chitty wasn't going to change. No amount of endurance or hope would make him see her pain. For the sake of her child, for the sake of her own life, she knew she had to find a way out. The day finally broke and Chitty opened the door for her to come and make breakfast for him. She was really tired and feeling pain, so she was managing to make the meal. Then Chitty stumbled into the kitchen angrily. Where's the breakfast I told you to make? I just hope it's ready. Don't tell me you've not finished making. Gosh, you're so lazy and useless. I hate you. Before he could finish the statement, he angrily poured the hot water on fire on her wife and didn't feel remorseful. Ngozi screamed in pain as the hot water splashed on her arm. Her skin burned, and the pain was so sharp it felt like fire. She held her arm, tears rolling down her cheeks. Chitty stood by the doorway, looking angry. Maybe next time you won't keep me waiting for food, he shouted. Ngozi didn't reply. She just sat on the floor, shaking from the pain. Chitty walked out of the house and slammed the door behind him. She could hear him pacing outside, muttering angrily, but she was too weak to care. Her phone was on the table. She knew she needed help, but didn't know how to move. With shaking hands, she pushed herself up, biting her lip to stop from crying louder. The pain was unbearable, but she finally reached her phone and called her best friend. Amaka, she said weakly when her friend answered. Please, come. I need help. Ngozi, what's wrong? Are you okay? Amaka asked, worried. Just come. Please, I'm begging you, Ngozi whispered. I'm coming now, Amaka said firmly. Amaka arrived as fast as she could. She ran inside and found Ngozi sitting on the couch, holding her arm. Her face was pale, and the pain was clear in her eyes. What happened, Ngozi? Amaka asked, kneeling beside her. Ngozi avoided her eyes. Just, take me to the hospital, she whispered. Amaka didn't ask any more questions. She helped Ngozi up carefully and saw the overturned pot and water on the kitchen floor. She felt anger bubbling inside her, but decided to focus on getting Ngozi to the hospital first. At the hospital, Ngozi sat quietly while the nurse cleaned her arm and wrapped it in bandages. Her arm was badly burned, and she couldn't stop shaking. Amaka sat in the corner, watching her friend with tears in her eyes. When the nurse left, Amaka moved closer. Ngozi, tell me what happened. You can't keep this inside anymore, she said gently. Ngozi took a deep breath. Her voice was soft and shaky. It's Chitty. He was angry because I didn't make food on time, she said, her eyes staring at the floor. I was tired. I've been working all day, and I couldn't cook fast enough. He poured the hot water on me and left. Amaka's heart broke hearing this. She held Ngozi's hand tightly. Ngozi, this is not love. He's hurting you. You don't deserve this, she said. Ngozi's tears fell harder. I don't know what to do. Where would I go? What will people say? Amaka looked her in the eye and spoke firmly. You don't have to do this alone. I'll help you. You're not going back there like this. You deserve better. Ngozi wanted to believe her, but the fear and shame were heavy. All she could do was cry in her friend's arms, feeling a little hope for the first time in a long time. Ngozi was seated on the edge of the couch, her arm still wrapped in bandages from the burn Chidi had inflicted days ago. The pain throbbed constantly, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. Amaka sat opposite her, watching her silently. Ngozi, Amaka began gently, you can't keep living like this. This is not a life. This is torture. Ngozi shook her head. What can I do, Amaka? I don't have anywhere to go. Chidi has made sure of that. Amaka leaned forward, gripping her friend's hand. You have me. You don't need to beg me to help you, I'll do it, no matter what. We'll find a way to get you out of this. You can't keep letting him destroy you. Ngozi blinked back tears, her throat tight. Amaka, No excuses, Ngozi, Amaka interrupted firmly. You deserve better than this. I'll make all the arrangements. You just need to trust me and stay strong. Ngozi nodded, her heart heavy, but slightly lighter knowing Amaka was in her corner. That evening, Ngozi returned home as if nothing had changed. She moved about the house, cooking dinner while trying to mask her pain. By the time Chidi walked in, she had already set the table. He sat down without acknowledging her, digging into his meal. When he was done, he wiped his mouth and looked at her with a dark expression. Ngozi, come to the room, he ordered. Ngozi stiffened, fear gripping her. Chidi, I'm not feeling well. Can't it wait? His eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you trying to disobey me? Before she could respond, he grabbed her arm and dragged her into the bedroom. She cried out in pain as his grip pressed against her bandaged arm, but he didn't care. Inside the room, Chidi shoved her onto the bed. Don't test me, Ngozi. You know how this ends. She tried to fight him off, her voice trembling. Chidi, please, I'm tired. I can't do this tonight. Her resistance only fueled his anger. He pinned her down with his weight, ignoring her tears and pleas. To him, her cries were nothing more than background noise. He took what he wanted, as he always did, leaving her broken and weeping beneath him. When he was done, Chidi rolled over and fell asleep almost instantly, snoring as if he hadn't just shattered his wife's spirit again. Ngozi lay on the bed, her body aching and her heart heavy with despair. Silent tears streamed down her face as she stared at the ceiling. She reached for her phone with trembling hands and sent a message to Amaka. He did it again, Amaka. I don't know how much more I can take. Please, just come tomorrow. I need help. She placed the phone back on the nightstand and curled into herself, her sobs muffled against the pillow. The next morning, Amaka arrived at Ngozi's house unannounced. When Ngozi opened the door, her eyes were swollen from crying, and her movements were stiff from the pain. Amaka took one look at her and said, "Pack your things, Ngozi. We're leaving now." Ngozi hesitated. Chidi. I don't care about Chidi, Amaka snapped. He can rot in this house for all I care. You're coming with me, and that's final. Ngozi nodded, too exhausted to argue. She grabbed some bags, hurriedly stuffing in clothes, and a few personal items. Tears filled her eyes as she looked around the house one last time, her heart torn between fear and relief. Amaka put a protective arm around her. Let's go, before he comes back. Ngozi followed Amaka out the door, her heart pounding as she left the house that had been her prison for so long. Ngozi sat in the small, dimly lit apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. She was finally free, at least for now. Amaka had helped her escape, taking her in after everything that had happened. It was just a small apartment, but it felt like freedom. The events of the day kept replaying in Ngozi's mind, and she could barely breathe from the weight of it all. Her arm, still bandaged from the burn, throbbed in pain. Amaka sat next to her, offering her comfort, but Ngozi still couldn't shake the feeling that she might not be safe for long. Amaka turned to her with a reassuring smile. "You're safe here, Ngozi. Don't worry. Just rest now." Tears welled in Ngozi's eyes. "I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't go back. But I'm so scared." "You don't have to go back," Amaka said, her voice firm. "You're not alone anymore. You have me, and I will help you get through this. We'll figure everything out, one step at a time." Ngozi nodded but didn't respond. She had never imagined her life would come to this, a life where her own home had become a prison. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. "I'll help you get on your feet, okay?" Amaka continued. "But you have to trust me. You can't go back to him." Ngozi swallowed hard, her mind racing. Could she really leave everything behind? Could she really leave Chidi, the man who had tormented her for so long? She wasn't sure, but at that moment, she knew there was no other option. Meanwhile, Chidi returned home late that night, his mind heavy with the stress of work. But when he stepped into the house, something felt wrong. The quiet. The emptiness. "Ngozi," he called out, his voice demanding. There was no answer. He stepped further into the living room, his eyes scanning the place. Her things were gone. The bed was undisturbed. Panic set in. "Ngozi," he called again, louder this time, his voice laced with anger. Still, no answer. His chest tightened. She couldn't have just left. He had been the one to make the rules. He was the one in control. She had no right to walk out on him. His fists clenched as he stormed through the house, looking in every room, every corner. But it was clear, she was gone. "Where the hell is she?" he muttered, his frustration growing. Chidi grabbed his phone, dialed her number, and pressed it to his ear. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. "Where the hell are you, Ngozi?" he growled. His eyes scanned the house again, as if expecting her to suddenly appear. But she didn't. His pride burned in his chest. She thought she could just walk away from him? He wasn't going to let that happen. No, he wouldn't let her disrespect him like that. He slammed his fist against the wall, the sound of his anger echoing through the empty house. His mind raced, thoughts clouded with rage. How could she just leave? After everything he'd done for her, she had the nerve to run off like this? Chidi stormed around the house, his fury growing by the second. His pride was at stake now. She had humiliated him, and he wouldn't let her get away with it. He would find her. He would make sure she came back. His eyes narrowed as he thought of all the things he could do. He would track her down. He would make her understand that she couldn't just leave him. She was his. The house felt suffocating. Chidi paced around the room, clenching his fists and grinding his teeth. He had to find her. He couldn't let her go.